this morning. Researchers virtually unwrapped the entirety of scroll P. Herc 1667 stored at the National Library of Naples, revealing almost 1.5.
What you just heard is real. For 2,000 years, these scrolls sat sealed in ash, written off as worthless charcoal. Then, in June 2026, an AI read one completely without ever touching it. And the first words it recovered stopped the room cold. When Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it didn't just bury a city, it entombed an entire intellectual world, one that had been quietly accumulating the most dangerous and beautiful ideas of the ancient mind. The Villa of the Papyri held what scholars now believe was the most extraordinary private library ever lost to history. For 2 millennia, those words stayed buried, silent. Then, a single AI pipeline cracked the silence open, and what it found underneath isn't just a curiosity. Stoic arguments, Epicurean philosophy, voices that shaped how civilization thinks about death, meaning, and the good life. Most of it still sealed underground, waiting. Here is what actually happened on the morning Vesuvius woke up. The volcano didn't give Herculaneum a slow death. It gave it a fast one. A superheated pyroclastic surge, moving at over 100 kilometers per hour and reaching temperatures near 300 degrees Celsius, hit the town in minutes. Not hours, minutes. And in that compressed, catastrophic instant, something almost miraculous occurred. The scrolls carbonized so rapidly, so completely, that their internal structure was preserved at the molecular level. The heat didn't destroy the ink. It locked it in place like a photograph taken by fire. The Villa of the Papyri sat just outside Herculaneum's western edge, overlooking the Bay of Naples. Whoever owned it, and historians still debate that question, had assembled something between 1,800 and 1,800 scrolls. Let that number settle for a moment. 1,800 texts. In a world where books were copied by hand, one at a time, that collection represented an almost incomprehensible investment of wealth, time, and intellectual intent. It is, by every measure, the only library from classical antiquity to survive intact. Every other ancient library, Alexandria, Pergamon, the great repositories of Rome, exists today only as a name. This one exists as ash. The archaeologist Andrew Wallace Hadrill put it in terms that sound almost perverse when you first hear them. He said that catastrophic destruction is exceptional preservation. And he was right. The same force that killed Herculaneum is the reason we can read it. Vesuvius didn't erase the library, it sealed it. But the story of what came next is where it gets painful. In the 1750s, Bourbon excavators tunneling under the volcanic rock began pulling scrolls out of the ground. They had no framework for what they were looking at. They saw black, brittle cylinders that crumbled at the touch. Many of them were thrown away, discarded, tossed onto rubble heaps because nobody could imagine that a charred log might contain the living thoughts of a philosopher who had walked the same streets as Julius Caesar. The workers were not fools. They simply had no way of knowing what they held, and that ignorance cost us something we will never fully calculate. The scrolls that survived that first wave of excavation were eventually recognized as papyrus manuscripts. Scholars tried to unroll them. Some succeeded, partially, using techniques that required moistening the fragile material and peeling it apart layer by layer. It worked, barely, and at enormous cost. Each attempt destroyed as much as it revealed. The words that emerged were fragmentary, tantalizing. Mostly the writings of a philosopher named Philodemus, an Epicurean who had lived and worked in the villa itself. His voice came through in pieces. But the rest of the collection, the scrolls too damaged, too tightly fused to risk unrolling, stayed silent. And here is the detail that should make you lean forward. Scholars have long suspected that the villa's main library, the room containing the Greek philosophical texts, has never been found. What was excavated in the 18th century may represent only a fraction of what is still down there. Chrysippus, Aristotle, works by authors whose names we know only because later writers quoted them. Lost arguments, lost proofs, lost entire schools of thought. All of it potentially sitting in sealed chambers beneath 30 meters of volcanic rock, a few kilometers from the modern city of Herculaneum. Those charcoal logs that got thrown away, the ones the Bourbon workers dismissed as rubble. Some of them held the words of Chrysippus's inner circle, the Stoic thinkers who shaped Roman philosophy for centuries. We know that now. We know it because the technology finally caught up to what the volcano preserved. But knowing something is down there and being able to read it are two very different problems. For 250 years, the gap between those two things seemed impossible to close. The scrolls that survived were too fragile to open. The ones still buried were unreachable. And the ones that had already been excavated sat in museum vaults, slowly deteriorating, holding their secrets in the dark. That changed when someone decided to stop trying to open the scrolls at all. Here is the specific claim you need to understand before any of this makes sense. The first man to attempt recovering the Herculaneum scrolls almost certainly destroyed more knowledge than he saved. His name was Father Antonio Piaggio, a Vatican librarian, and in 1756 he built a machine, a contraption of silk threads and slow-turning screws, designed to peel open the carbonized scrolls one microscopic layer at a time. It was painstaking work, agonizing actually. Unrolling a single scroll could take years, and the process was so delicate, so unforgiving, that the slightest miscalculation caused the brittle charcoal surface to crack, splinter, and crumble into fragments too small to ever reassemble. Piaggio's machine was a genuine act of dedication. It was also, in hindsight, a catastrophe in slow motion. Then came the 19th century, and it got worse. Scholars who lacked Piaggio's patience, or his machine, tried a more direct approach. They peeled the scrolls apart by hand, layer by layer, working from the outside in, trying to reach readable text buried deeper inside. Some of them used chemicals, others used blades. The logic was sound enough on paper. Get to the text, save what you can. But the execution was brutal. Hundreds of fragments were lost entirely. Pieces of text that had survived a volcanic eruption, 2,000 years of burial, and the excavation itself were destroyed in the reading rooms of European museums by men who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. The irony is almost too painful to sit with. By the early 20th century, the scholarly consensus had quietly, grimly solidified around a single conclusion. The remaining unrolled scrolls, roughly 600 of them still sitting in vaults in Naples and Paris and Oxford, were simply unreadable. The damage was too severe. The contrast between the carbon ink and the carbonized papyrus was essentially zero. You were looking at black writing on a black surface. Experts declared the problem unsolvable and more or less moved on. That declaration stood for decades. Then, in 2016, a computer scientist named Brent Seals at the University of Kentucky did something that quietly rewrote the rules. He used X-ray computed tomography, the same technology hospitals use to scan the human body, to digitally image an ancient scroll from En-Gedi in Israel. The scroll was so damaged it had been reduced to a solid lump of charred material. No one had been able to open it for decades. Seals' team virtually unwrapped it. They computationally peeled back the digital layers, flattened the surface, and revealed legible Hebrew text from the book of Leviticus, without ever physically touching the scroll itself. Not a single fragment was lost. Not a single letter was destroyed in the reading. The scholarly world took notice. Slowly, cautiously, but it took notice. Because here was the proof of concept everyone had been waiting for. You did not have to destroy the object to read it. You did not have to peel it, cut it, or dissolve it. You could scan it, model it, and read it from the inside out. Virtually, safely, with the original artifact left completely intact. Seals had proven the method worked on one scroll, under controlled conditions with a relatively straightforward text. But the Herculaneum scrolls were a different order of problem entirely. They were thinner, more tightly wound, more severely carbonized. And the ink used by the ancient scribes at Herculaneum was carbon-based, which meant it had essentially the same density as the carbonized papyrus it was written on. The Engedi scroll used metallic ink, which showed up clearly in X-ray scans. Herculaneum scrolls offered no such contrast. The ink was effectively invisible to the scanner. That was the wall everyone kept hitting. That was the problem that seemed, for years, like it might be genuinely insurmountable. But someone had an idea about how to use artificial intelligence to see what human eyes and conventional scanners simply could not. And what they found when they finally looked inside those scrolls is the reason you are watching this video right now. In March of 2023, a computer scientist, a former NASA imaging specialist, and a Silicon Valley investor made a specific public announcement. They were launching a competition called the Vesuvius Challenge. The prize pool was real money, hundreds of thousands of dollars. The goal was equally real and almost defiantly ambitious. Read a complete Herculaneum scroll before the end of the year. Not a fragment, not a few lines. A full, coherent, readable text from inside a carbonized scroll that had been sealed shut for nearly 2,000 years. The challenge was crowdsourced, open to anyone. Researchers, students, independent coders, all of them working from the same foundational dataset. That dataset was the result of work Brent Seals's team had done at the Particle Accelerator facility at Diamond Light Source in the United Kingdom, where they had scanned several Herculaneum scrolls at resolutions so fine they could theoretically detect structures smaller than a human cell. The scans were extraordinary. The raw data was all there. The problem was still the ink. Carbon ink on carbonized papyrus. No density contrast, no metallic signature. The standard imaging pipeline simply could not distinguish the writing surface from the writing itself. This is where the machine learning component became decisive. A team of researchers, working independently, competing for the prize, trained neural networks to detect extremely subtle textural differences in the CT scan data. Not density differences, textural ones. It turned out that the physical act of writing with a stylus on papyrus leaves a faint but measurable three-dimensional trace in the surface of the material. The ink sits slightly differently. The fiber structure of the papyrus is microscopically disturbed by the application of ink. These differences are invisible to the human eye looking at a scan. They are invisible to conventional imaging software. But a machine learning model, trained on thousands of examples and optimized specifically for this problem, could learn to see them. The model worked. In late 2023, the first prize was awarded. Readable Greek text had been extracted from inside an unopened Herculaneum scroll. Roughly 15 columns. Enough to confirm the method was real and the approach was scalable. The team kept going. The challenge continued. The models improved. The pipeline, ultra-high-resolution CT scanning, geometric virtual unwrapping to flatten the scroll's layers into a readable surface, and machine learning ink detection running across the entire dataset was refined with every iteration. Then, on June 25, 2026, the team announced a result that stopped the papyrological community cold. PFERC 1667 A scroll that had sat in a museum vault for over 2 centuries, declared unreadable, handled by generations of scholars who never got a single word out of it, had been read. End to end. 1.5 meters of unrolled text. 20 to 22 columns of continuous Greek prose recovered without the scroll ever being physically opened or touched. The scroll had been cracked, not metaphorically, computationally, completely, irreversibly cracked. And what the text actually said, what was inside that scroll after 2,000 years of silence, stunned the papyrologists who read it. Herc 1667 contained a Stoic ethics treatise. That much was established within the first hours of the papyrologists working through the recovered text. But the specific content, the names, the arguments, the connections it revealed, that is where things became genuinely extraordinary. The text mentions a figure named Aristocreon. That name matters more than it might initially seem. Aristocreon was the nephew of Chrysippus, the third and arguably most influential head of the Stoic philosophical school in ancient Athens. Chrysippus was the man who systematized Stoicism, who wrote the arguments that held the school together, who shaped the philosophical tradition that would eventually influence Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and the entire Roman intellectual world. Ancient sources credited him with writing over 700 works. And yet, before the Vesuvius Challenge, almost nothing written by Chrysippus had survived. A few fragments, quotations preserved in other people's texts, the intellectual architecture of an entire philosophical tradition, and almost none of its original source material. Herc 1667 does not contain Chrysippus's own writing, but it references his family, his circle, his immediate intellectual legacy in ways that scholars had never had direct access to before. It is a window into a world that was, until June of 2026, almost entirely dark. Then came Herc 172. This second scroll, processed through the same pipeline, yielded something that no one had predicted. A previously unknown book, identified as Book 8 of Philodemus's multi-volume work, On Gods. Philodemus of Gadara was an Epicurean philosopher who lived and worked at Herculaneum in the 1st century before the Common Era. His library, almost certainly his personal collection, is believed to be the primary source of the scrolls found in the Villa of the Papyri. Scholars had already recovered portions of his work from earlier, physically unrolled scrolls. But Book 8 of On Gods was missing. Scholars knew the work existed across multiple volumes. They did not know what Book 8 contained. They were not certain it had survived at all. It had survived, sealed inside a carbonized lump that had been sitting in a Neapolitan museum since the 18th century. And the confirmation came in the most direct way possible. The recovered text included a colophon, an ancient scribal notation at the end of a text, identifying the work and its author. Philodemus, named explicitly, in his own words, offering a direct philosophical address on the nature of the divine. 2,000 years of silence, and then his name, right there at the end, as clear as the day it was written. 2 scrolls, 2 recoveries, 2 texts that rewrote what scholars thought they knew about the surviving record of ancient philosophy. Now consider this. The Villa of the Papyri has never been fully excavated. The rooms that archaeologists reached in the 18th century, the ones that yielded the scrolls already in museum vaults, represent only a fraction of the structure. There are sealed chambers beneath the ash that no modern excavator has ever entered. And if 2 scrolls from the collection that was already found can yield a lost Stoic treatise and a missing book of Philodemus, then what is still waiting in the rooms that no one has opened yet? Somewhere beneath the ash, the greatest revelation is still sealed. The rooms no excavator has entered may hold answers that would rewrite everything we think we know. Comment below.